careful and take heed of whom you take your deen and your religion from. So, in that sense, we need to know who we are taking our deen from and who we're learning from. And so, it's very important for us to understand who these people were. So, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he was born in 1207, according to the Gregorian calendar, and he passed away in 1273, which makes him around 66 years of age at passing. So he lived for about 66 years. It's an interesting figure, that, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his age, and the ulama have said, and I've heard numerous times from ulama, that the average age of this ummah will be based around the physical lifetime of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so you do find that quite frequently, that's the case. But anyway, he was 66 years of age when he passed away. He was born in Balkh. This is an area that is no longer existent with that particular name. Modern day Afghanistan, part of the Persian territory at that time. So he was Persian by birth, and the Persian territory at the time, was quite huge and it was quite expansive. So Balkh and Khorasan is the wider territory, and there's so many great ulama that have come out of this territory or this area of Khorasan. It's unbelievable. Some of the greatest scholars, the Muhaddis, Imam Tirmidhi, Imam Ibn Majah, Imam Sarkhasi, the great Hanafi faqih and jurist. So many ulama, the list just goes on and on. A very fertile land in terms of producing scholars and ulama, Khorasan. Before, in order to find out who Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi himself actually was, we need to look at his family background and his father, his grandfather, his family, and so on. Alauddin Khwarizm Shah, he was the king of that area, that territory at the time. He had a daughter, and he brought her up with a great deal of love and care. And obviously, being a princess and in the royal family, was very well looked after, very well taught, and brought up with a great deal of love. And when she came of age, he started to think of finding a suitable partner for her. And so he spoke to his wazir, and he said, "We need to find a husband for my daughter." And the wazir came back to the king, and the king had said, it has to be somebody who is on a par with royalty. I'm not going to give my daughter to just anybody. It has to be somebody who's on a par with royalty. And so the wazir, after some time, and after thinking about it, he came back to the king and he said, "I found somebody who is very suitable." And he mentioned a name to the king, Jalaluddin Hussain. He said, "I think you should wed your daughter to Maulana Jalaluddin Hussain." And he said, "This is one of the greatest scholars of our time, and in terms of rank, a scholar, someone who knows the deen, an imam of the deen and scholar of the deen, certainly is not just on par, but may perhaps outrank royalty. So this is somebody who will be definitely, worthy of your family, and vice versa." And so the king, Alauddin, he started contemplating about this. And at that time, Maulana Jalaluddin Hussain was 30 years of age. So he was 30 years old, in the prime of his youth in that sense, and one of the greatest scholars of his time. How many of you heard the name Imam Fakhruddin Razi, author of Tafsir Kabir? So even to the lay people, that's such a huge name, that he's earned himself such a name that even our, alhamdulillah, even the public know to some extent who Imam Fakhruddin Razi is. and he was a student of Imam Jalaluddin Hussain. So at the age of 30, he had reached such heights in terms of the knowledge, the Islamic knowledge that he'd acquired. So earned himself a huge reputation, such that people like Imam Fakhruddin Razi, rahimahullah ta'ala, were his students. Meantime, while the king was still thinking about this, he had a dream. And blessed he was that he had the honor of meeting the Prophet ﷺ in his dream. And the Prophet ﷺ urged him and he said, "What are you thinking about? There's nothing to contemplate. You should wed your daughter to Jalaluddin Hussain." And that same night, the Prophet ﷺ also blessed Imam Jalaluddin Hussain in his dream. And he said to him that the king or his representative will come to you with his daughter's hand in marriage. Don't decline and accept this proposal. And so the following day, the king then sent this proposal to his wazir, and Maulana Jalaluddin Hussain, who'd had this dream, who'd had this instruction from the Prophet ﷺ, he accepted this proposal. And so the two were married. Shortly after, they had a son by the name of Bahauddin. Bahauddin Walad, and he was only 2 years old. This child was only 2 years old when his father, Maulana Jalaluddin, passed away. And so he was brought up by his mother. Now the mother was the daughter of the king. She was a princess. And so the child grew up very well looked after in terms of financially and in terms of the comfort of his home. There was nothing ever missing. And so, however, the mother was also, this was someone who'd spent some part of her life married to arguably the greatest scholar of that time, of that place. So you would expect that to have some kind of influence over this woman. And here I have to say that you look at the lives of many of our great awliya, many of them, and you will find that they were orphaned at an early age and they were brought up by their mothers. And I often say that this highlights the contribution of these women in terms of making Islamic history. People like Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahimahullah ta'ala, was brought up by his mother because he was orphaned very early. And so if it wasn't for these mothers, we would not have such remarkable individuals like Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, rahimahullah ta'ala. And so this is specifically a point to think about, perhaps for the ladies, and also in terms of parents who have daughters, and in terms of educating their daughters and bringing them up and so on. I think that's something very, very important, but I won't dwell on that too long. He was brought up by his mother, and he was brought up in great comfort and splendor, and naturally because of that, he started to become inclined towards the throne, because he was this grandson of the king. He was the maternal grandson of the king. He was brought up in that environment, and he started to incline towards the throne. It was then, when his mother realized this, that she took her child to a library, and she took him into the library, and he had a look around, and there were thousands of books. This is in a time where books were scarce and very difficult to come by, and everything that was available was painstakingly handwritten. And so he saw this huge collection, and he asked his mother, he said, what is this all about? Why have you brought me here? And she said, I brought you here to show you the inheritance of your father. This is what you've inherited from your father, not the throne. So even though she was royalty herself, she took her child away from that and she showed him the path that his father had chosen. And she explained to him, she said, the whole reason why your father was ever married to me was because of these books. Because he had this, he had this wealth of knowledge. And so I want you to start studying the deen and start learning the deen. And so he did. From that moment he took a very keen interest in learning the deen. He obviously didn't have any difficulties financially, being well cared for, and so he studied and he became again one of the great. Very quickly he acquired a reputation as one of the greatest scholars of his time, of that area. And there's even a narration that when he started to, when people acquire fame or notoriety in something, there's always people there in the same field who are going to feel a little aggrieved. And so it happens amongst people of knowledge as well. And so when his reputation began to increase and spread, he started to experience some of that hostility. And so there's a narration, it's mentioned that one night the Prophet ﷺ blessed all the ulama of that land, and he visited them in their dreams. In one night, at the same time, all of them. And they saw the Prophet ﷺ, and they saw this young scholar, Maulana Bahauddin, sitting on the right hand side of the Prophet ﷺ, next to him on his feet. And the Prophet ﷺ, he instructed them. He said that this person, he has seniority over all of the ulama in his time, in his area. And so the following morning there were hordes of ulama lining up outside of his door to pledge allegiance to him, to take bay'ah from Maulana Bahauddin. And so this Maulana Bahauddin is the father of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. The other alim who married the royal princess, Maulana Jalaluddin Hussain, he's the grandfather of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. And in terms of actual birth names, it's narrated that Imam Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, his name was Mohammed, his father's name was Muhammad, his grandfather's name was also Muhammad. And all three of them, great scholars in their own right. And so you see where this heritage or this knowledge actually is inherited from. That's why it was important to give you this background. And it's not that this was a family that was alien to prophetic secrets. The reason why I say prophetic secrets is Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, anybody know where his lineage goes to? He's a descendant of, historically, of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala. In his lineage, his genealogy, he's a descendant of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala. And so, not strangers to prophetic knowledge and prophetic secrets. Now, by this time, the throne obviously, when Imam Bahauddin, he grew up and his mother took him towards studying the deen and so on. When he finished, when he'd become a scholar and when he'd graduated and so on, he was offered the throne. He was offered kingship. But it was on the command of his mother that he refused. I find this absolutely intriguing and remarkable. What an amazing mother. But she didn't allow him to accept the throne. That this is not your destiny. And so he refused to accept the throne. But his successor, or the person who actually did come to the throne, was Jalaluddin Khwarizm Shah. And so he, naturally there was a bit of jealousy there. Or perhaps not even jealousy, just a bit of fear, and it wasn't all of a sudden. There's always people there in and around who are causing problems and who are whispering things. And so there was around him as well. And there was always somebody whispering in his ear, look, he's got so much respect. He's one of the greatest scholars around. And everyone is besotted with, and everyone loves him. What if he decides to claim the throne? What's going to become of your kingdom? And so there was always these whisperings. And so eventually one day he decided to come outright, and he went and he met with Maulana Bahauddin. He went and met him and he said, look, I know people love you and respect you, you're a great scholar, but this land, there's no room here for two kings. So he offered to abdicate the throne, and he said, take it. You take it. You become king. It was at that point that Maulana Bahauddin realized, how things were going, and not wishing to create any discord, but also not wishing to take up kingship. He turned down this offer. He said, I don't want your throne. I don't want anything. Just let it be, and I will leave from here. I will go from here, and you can govern in peace. It was at that time that he decided to migrate from there. And at this time, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he was 5 years old. And his brother Alauddin was 7 years old. So when he was 5 years old, he relocated from Balkh in modern day Afghanistan, and they started traveling. And eventually they ended up in Konya, where he rests today. When they started packing, remember what I said to you about the library and about his inheritance of his father. When they started packing, they obviously packed everything and they readied themselves to go. And this was not just this family that was going. There were many of Maulana Bahauddin's disciples, his murids and their families, and all in all there was more than 40 people in that caravan who left from Balkh. It was a large group. They packed away all of their belongings. Just his books occupied 300 camels. At that time, again, knowing the value of a book, it wasn't like going into a bookshop and buying a book. So 300 camels were occupied with just his books, and they left from there. On their travels, en route, wherever they went, they received a huge reception. People welcomed them with open arms. And his reputation truly did precede him. Wherever they went, people wanted to learn from him and study from him. And so, we can only imagine how amazing this journey would have been. It's not like today, it's not like stepping into your car and driving somewhere, or jumping on the train or getting on a plane and landing in a few hours. This whole journey from Balkh to Konya took them years, many years. And so a little about that journey as well. So they left from Balkh, and eventually after some traveling, after stopping in various places, teaching in various places, and actually passing on some of his heritage in various places, eventually they arrived in Baghdad. Now, when they arrived in Baghdad, they were stopped at the gates. Right? Traditionally, the bigger cities and countries even, they had gates where you would enter from for security and so on. He was stopped at the gate. The reason being because the Khalifa of Baghdad, the leader, Amir of Baghdad at the time, he had some issues with Jalaluddin Khwarizm Shah, the king of Balkh. So they had some tussle going on between them, they had some issues between them. And he suspected that this person who's just come from Balkh and these 40 people and this caravan, these people have come to cause some trouble in his territory. That they've either come as spies for Khwarizm Shah, or they've come to cause some mischief or trouble. And so he sent one of his advisors to the gate. How many of you heard the name Shaykh Shahabuddin Sohrawardi? Again, in his own right, a huge name, the founder of the Sohrawardi Sufi Tariq and Silsila. He's the father of the Sohrawardi Tariq. He was the advisor that the king sent to meet Maulana Bahauddin and his family and his friends. The moment he saw him, he recognized him, he realized who he was. He went back to the king and he said to him, the king asked, he said, who are these people, what have they come for? And his response was, he is only Bahauddin, meaning that he has come in his own personal capacity. It's nothing to do with the king, nothing to do with anyone else. And he then introduced him as a great scholar, and he said he's come in his own right, he's traveling and he's passing through. And so they were then allowed entry into Baghdad. And it's narrated that Shaykh Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, he asked Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi's father, he asked him to come and stay in his home, to allow him to host, and he refused. He said, we are people of books and we are best entertained in madaris, in a madrasa. And so he went to one of the madrasas in Baghdad and he stayed there for a while. The Khalifa then, realizing who this person was, he sent him a gift of 3,000 dinar. 3,000 dinar. A very sizable amount. And, realistically speaking, as a traveler in those days, the kind of expenses that this group will have been incurring in those travels, surely he could do with that 3,000 dinar. But he refused, turned them down. Why? He refused, and he sent a message back to the king. He said, I can't accept these because I don't trust that your earnings are entirely legal and halal. I don't trust that everything you have earned has been earned purely. And so this is the kind of sustenance that Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi was brought up on. Again, that thing about sustenance, we've talked about this before as well. Right? So this is the level of care that he took. Whereas he was actually, in terms of, if you were looking for a Shari ruling or a fatwa, there's nothing wrong with taking that. It was a gift from another Muslim. Right? But knowing the history of these people, knowing how they were governing, he didn't trust that his earnings were entirely halal. That more than likely there would have been people that he'd actually taken land from, taken wealth from, and without any right and so on. And so he refused, and he sent that gift back. eventually, after some time, this was obviously a passing visit. The intention was never there to settle in Baghdad. And that becomes clear from the conversation that subsequently took place between Maulana Bahauddin and Shaykh Shahabuddin Suhrawardi. It becomes clear that he was never intending to stay in Baghdad permanently. Because after a short while, he spoke to Shaykh Shahabuddin and he said, I'm leaving you and I'm leaving Baghdad in your hands. Reason? He said, because you have been given authority of Baghdad by Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani Rahimahullah Ta'ala. So he said, this is your share and I'm leaving it in your hands. And so they decided to move on. When news of this reached the Khalifa of Baghdad, the Amir of Baghdad, he sent a message to Maulana and he said, before you go, I want you to deliver a sermon at our Grand Mosque. And so he accepted and he promised that he would deliver the Jummah sermon on that Friday and then he would leave. So as Jummah approached and as Jummah came, Maulana Bahauddin, he came to their Grand Masjid and the Khalifa, the Amir was there himself and all the ulama of Baghdad were gathered there. And they listened to his khutbah and his wa'az. And as soon as he started speaking, tears began to fall from their eyes. You know, the impact was such. But as he'd announced, he then left from there, and eventually from there they traveled to Damascus, to Damascus in Sham, in Syria. The same thing there, stayed for a short while. People came seeking knowledge and other blessings, and he distributed those blessings. They requested, they pleaded, they said, stay here, don't go from here. And again he told them, he said, I can't stay. My dust has another destination. In other words, he was saying that, you know, I'm destined to take my last breath somewhere else. And so they left from there as well. They moved from there to Erzincan. And again, these people said exactly the same thing. They said, stay with us, don't leave. And there, Maulana, he said, I can't stay. Again, he said the same thing, I can't stay. I have an ultimate destination. But I will prolong my stay with you on one condition. Look at the attachment with the deen and with knowledge of this family. This is Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi's father. When he set off, he was 5 years old. By now, he will be older. It will be a few years since it set off. And so he said to those people, he said, I will stay, I will prolong my stay. I can't stay permanently, but I will prolong my stay on one condition. And that is that you build a madrasa and I will set it up for you. I will start teaching. And once that madrasa is self-sustaining, once it's able to carry on without me, then I will leave. And so again, the Amir of the city, who'd instantly become attached to Maulana, he accepted this proposal and he said, I would like you to stay and I personally will ensure that this madrasa is built. And so it was. The madrasa was built, he stayed there, he started teaching. As students gathered, as he prepared other teachers, once it was ready and functioning, he then bid farewell and they moved on, and eventually they arrived in Kunya. During this time, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi rahimahullah ta'ala was under the tutelage of his father as well. The most predominant influence in terms of his knowledge and sciences is his own father, Maulana Bahauddin. it was while they were staying there that they received a message from Sultan Alauddin Kaikabad, who was the Sultan, the Amir or the king of Konya and the surrounding areas. And he had become acquainted with Maulana, and he sent a message and he requested that they come and take up residence there. And that was their final destination. That's where they eventually ended up. So Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, born in Balkh, left there at the age of 5, and after a lot of traveling, eventually ended up with his father in Konya, and that's where they remained, and that's where he rests today. Maulana Rumi, rahmallah ta'ala, there was a natural attachment with the deen and with tasawwuf and sufiya from childhood. And he himself, he states and he says that I used to recite Surah Al-Kawthar in Fajr. And I used to cry. When I used to recite Surah Al-Kawthar, I used to cry. And he says that, very quickly, right from a young age, he says this was my practice from a young age, and when I would recite Surah Al-Kawthar, I would cry. And this surah truly is a treasure of the Quran. We often think about it as being the shortest surah of the Quran. And in spite of that, I have a commentary of Surah Al-Kawthar in my personal library, which spans over hundreds of pages. Just one surah, Al-Kawthar, these 3 short verses. And it really is a treasure of the Quran. But he says that it was during one of these mornings when I was reciting Surah Al-Kawthar early on in my life, and I was reciting Surah Al-Kawthar and I started crying, and I lost control of my emotions, and I cried and cried to such an extent that I eventually I fell unconscious. And they say that there's nothing that can put out the hellfire. There's nothing that can actually dampen it. And if you ever experienced the desert climate, or been to a very hot place like Middle East and so on, and in the midsummer, right in the middle of the day, if you go outside and you experience this burning hot wind, we know from some prophetic traditions and teachings of ulama that that's Jahannam, that's the hellfire, breathing. Imagine what the fire itself is like, and there's nothing that can put it out except a tear that falls out of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Truly, in reality, this is a point of reflection for all of us to think. In our lives, whatever, 20, 30, 40, whatever age you're at, in our lives, how many occasions has there been? We cry out of pain, we cry out of hunger, we cry for all sorts of reasons. We cry out of joy. But have we ever shed one tear in remembrance of Allah or out of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's something to think about. But Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi says he cried so much that he fainted. And he was awoken by someone speaking to him, someone unseen, and that was the beginning of his, what the ulama refer to as mukashafat as well, revelations, where some of the blinds are removed. That was the beginning of his mukashafat. He says also himself, he says at the age of 5, my nafs was completely dead. At the age of 5. And so someone asked, well, why did you carry on doing these exercises then? Because believe me, there were times where Maulana Rum, he fasted for 20 days consecutively without sahar and iftar. nothing in between, nothing to eat for 20, 30 days at a time. Wouldn't come out of his room, and would be in meditation, and as soon as it would be time for prayer, he would be facing the direction of the Qibla. So someone asked, well, why? What's the need for all of these these exercises or mujahada? Why the struggle? And he said, because you never know when it will awaken again and where it will attack from. It's a matter of keeping it in control and keeping it in check. His first teacher, as I mentioned before, was his honorable father. Aside from him, he also, a major influence in his life, another one of his teachers, who was also a disciple and student of his father. So he was Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi's teacher, but he himself was a student and disciple of Maulana Rumi's father. He was Sayyid Burhanuddin, Shaykh Burhanuddin. And so it's also mentioned that he also, through his father in childhood, he also met Shaykh Attar as well. And he was gifted a book by him as well, which he cherished all of his life. They often read. It was only after his father passed away that Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi actually travelled on and moved out of his family circle. When his father passed away, his student, Shaykh Burhanuddin, he then began to nurture and look after Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, and in particular his spiritual and educational needs. And it was after some time that he left for Damascus. He went back to Damascus to study. He went from there to a place called Larand, and there's a very interesting incident. When his father passed away, he passed away on a Friday. At that very same time, on that same Friday, his student, his disciple, Shaykh Burhanuddin, was sitting miles away. And in his gathering, he stood up all of a sudden. He said, Allahu Akbar, our Shaykh has passed away. And he set off. He set off for Konya. It took him 1 year to get to Konya. When he arrived there, by this time, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi had already left. And he was on his travels and his studies. He then wrote to him. He wrote to Maulana Rumi and he said, come back. You must come back. I've come back here for you. So he requested that he come back, and so Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, rahmallah ta'ala, he then came back to Konya, and he was nurtured and taught by Shaykh Burhanuddin in his hometown. When he met, as soon as Maulana arrived back, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, he arrived back in Konya. He said to him, I've come back for a reason. I have an amana of your father's which I need to pass on to you. I have an entrusted item which I need to pass on to you. But he said to him, the condition is that you need to do 120 days of meditation. And he gave him a room, and he said, this is your hujra, this is your place, this is where you must meditate for 120 days, and then I will give you the amana that your father entrusted me with. And so he did, and he checked on him after 40 days. When he checked on him after 40 days, he found him in a state of a spiritual trance, right? And meditating. And so He closed the door, went away. After another 40 days, he checked up on him. This time, he found Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi praying and crying uncontrollably. And so he went away again, and he came back after another 40 days when the 120 days were complete. This time, when Shaykh Burhanuddin opened the door, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi was sitting there as if he was waiting for him. And as he opened the door, he looked at him and he smiled. And so he went forward and he hugged him, he embraced him. He realized that he was now ready, and he said, this was, what you've achieved in these 120 days of meditation, where you are now, this was that amana, this was that trust that your father had given to me, which I've now transferred to you. And a very apt place to stop as well. So it's Nawaz time now. Inshallah, an earlier start than usual next week. If we can start for 7:15, please, so that we can finish again in time for Maghrib, because Maghrib will probably have come back to about 8:15. So 7:15, inshallah, next week. Any questions? Barakallah, thank you for attending. Inshallah, we'll pick it up from there next week.